The press keeps arguing that Moscow orchestrated this uprising. Is that true?
No, of course. I'll tell you honestly. Moscow looked at this with some bewilderment. I saw 36 passports belonging to Polish mercenaries. There were American specialists, British specialists, there was every kind of person there. They planted 2 anti-tank mines on the road I was traveling on. One of them exploded. The other didn't go off. Sitting next to me was my comrade, a fellow serviceman, Alexander Shubin. He was killed instantly. I suffered a spinal fracture, 9 fractures in my legs, and around 30 other injuries of various kinds. But by some miracle, I survived, because anti-tank mines destroy tanks, and I was traveling in a passenger car.
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Hello, and welcome to Against the Current. We present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keeps silent about. There are writers who can do more than just operate a typewriter. They can also handle a machine gun. One of them was the great American author Ernest Hemingway, who was seriously wounded as a young man on the Isonzo front in 1918. Another was the French author André Malraux, later Charles de Gaulle's Minister of Culture. He fought in the Spanish Civil War and was a co-founder of the anti-fascist resistance. Another is the Russian author Zakhar Prilepin. He fought in the Chechen War in the late 1990s and in Donbas. In 2023, an assassination attempt was made on him. He has had personal protection ever since. He is under EU sanctions. But we will not yield to anti-democratic and unconstitutional censorship. We believe that the better argument must prevail.
Hello. Thank you very much for your time. I speak Russian poorly, so there will be an interpreter.
What draws them into war?
I think that the Soviet Union, like the Russian Empire, is not a crude collection of territories. It is an organic Eurasian body that will reunite again and again under new circumstances. Perhaps some territories, such as the Baltics or maybe Azerbaijan, will begin their own geopolitical journey. But Ukraine, Little Russia, is an unconditional part of Russia. And for me, whose ancestors came from Ukraine, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother were from Ukraine and had Ukrainian surnames. These are inseparable parts of a single whole.
I'm interested in your family history, because that's what you've devoted your life to.
I'd like to clarify. Do you mean my family history involving my grandfathers who took part in World War II, or my personal history, including my own military record?
I mean both, of course, including the anti-fascist struggles in the Second World War. My family was deeply entangled in National Socialism. My mother's father was a member of the Nazi Party and a camp commander. My father's father was a German nationalist and supported the war.
Seriously. My paternal grandfather, Semyon Zakharovich Prilepin, was drafted in 1941. After 3 months of fighting on Ukrainian territory, he was taken prisoner. He spent the rest of the war in camps in Germany and survived by a miracle. None of those who were taken prisoner with him survived. None of those who were imprisoned with him during the first year, the second year, the third year. That is a separate story. I can't name all the camps he was held in, but he was constantly moved around, sold off. Sometimes to prisons, sometimes he ended up with certain families, sometimes in death camps. So there was a long history there.
I have always understood it as the responsibility of my generation of Germans to help ensure that such things never happen again. When I see German tanks rolling through the Donbas again today, I feel ashamed. Was that also one of your motives for going to fight?
The breakup in 1991 was already a tragedy for me. I was 16 years old, and I understood what was happening. Then came a whole series of civil conflicts on Russia's periphery: Moldova, Transnistria, Abkhazia, Ossetia, the North Caucasus, Chechnya, and Dagestan. And all of these conflicts were supported, one way or another, from the West. First and foremost by Britain and the United States, at that time Germany to a lesser extent, along with other players. But even then, it was already a tragedy for me. And 2014 and 2022 were a continuation of what had already been happening.
This also concerns Ukraine in particular. And above all, it began with the so-called Orange Revolution in 2004.
Exactly.
And then in 2014, they went to Donbas and fought. They also had contact with Zakharchenko, the leader of the independence movement.
That's true. That's true. And in the West, people often prefer not to notice the xenophobic, radically nationalist underpinnings of the 2014 Maidan. In 2004, this was still more or less hidden. By 2014, far-right groups in Ukraine had already gained strength and were the leading driving force behind the Maidan.
In the West, especially in Germany, the Maidan is portrayed as a revolution of dignity. But all the scholarly studies show that this was precisely not the case. Rather, the shots fired onto the Maidan came from buildings occupied by the right sector, meaning militant far-right extremists. So in your view, what was the Maidan?
To me, Maidan was a triumph of Western double standards. Because while, in Kyiv, in Lviv, and in the cities on the right bank of the Dnieper, people were first seizing government buildings and then weapons depots, taking weapons from Ukraine's police and arming the insurgents, the West welcomed all of it. Yes, these were wonderful people. They had risen up for freedom. But when exactly the same thing began happening in Donbas and Crimea, without any violence being committed, the West said, "Oh, this is terrible. They're breaking the law. They're bad people." And you are absolutely right. People were killed on Maidan, while no one was killed in Donbas or Crimea. Everything happened peacefully there. And 80 to 90% of the population, under any assessment by Western institutions, would have shown that they wanted autonomy and to join Russia.
You were in Donbas very early on, in 2014. How did you experience the beginning of the uprising in Donbas?
At that time, everyone in Donbas believed that their will was so obvious, so widespread, and involved such an overwhelming majority of the population that everyone would see it. They were eagerly waiting for foreign journalists, for any media outlets, for anyone with a microphone and a camera, so they could say, "Look, none of us wants to submit to Kyiv. We all have different views, different desires." Any polling company that had come to Donetsk or Luhansk would have shown that an overwhelming majority of people there did not want to accept Kyiv's Maidan. The viewers, that after the victory of the Kyiv Maidan, the first thing they did was revoke Russian status as a state language. They didn't even wait. They did it within a week, and people in Donbas understood perfectly well what all of this would lead to.
But the Western television networks, the Western media, pulled their correspondents out of Maidan, and then we were told, yes, Moscow organized all of this. What do you make of that?
I think the West showed a remarkable lack of interest in what was happening. But still, I'd like to talk about Western media, not about all people in the West. Because in 2014 and 2015, sanctions had not yet been imposed on me. I even spoke once in Germany, in East Germany, with the Russian writer Dmitry Glukovsky. It was a large hall with about 300 Germans in the audience. And Glukovsky said that the Kyiv Maidan was wonderful, that it was great, that it was for freedom. And I said that the uprising in Donbas, in Luhansk, in Crimea,
восстание на Донбассе, в Луганске, в Крыму. Это прекрасно. И 100%,
That was wonderful. And 100%, not 90%, but 100% of the Germans sitting in the hall were on my side. They shouted, "Yes, little Russia. Ukraine is Russia. Of course, let the Russians take it." And Glukovsky was shocked. He said, "What kind of Germans are these? They're KGB agents. They're not real Germans." So I think that if it hadn't been for the lying European media and corrupt European politicians, we could have come to an agreement with the people of Europe at that time. More or less the same situation existed in Italy, Spain, and France. I spoke there as well, everywhere, and everyone understood perfectly what this conflict was about.
In fact, especially in Germany, there is a considerable gap between public opinion among the population and the opinion presented by the press. And the press keeps arguing that Moscow orchestrated this uprising. Is that true?
No, of course not. First of all, it would have been impossible to stage, because in the end, tens and hundreds of thousands of people came out into the squares. On their own, without any help from Moscow, they seized government buildings in Kharkiv, Donetsk, Luhansk, and dozens of cities across the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And what's more, I'll tell you honestly, Moscow watched this with some bewilderment. At that point, Moscow thought that Crimea had worked out and that they didn't need anything more. They didn't want these problems. They kept calling the leaders of Donbas and saying, well, maybe you would agree to autonomy within Ukraine. Maybe you could somehow reach an agreement with Kiev. Maybe we could somehow fix this situation and avoid bringing it to a confrontation. In other words, Donbas was acting against Moscow's wishes.
Донбасс вел себя вопреки желанию Москвы.
I visited the Donbas after the start of the special military operation, after the start of the Russian invasion. And I spoke with many people. Some of them said, Putin let us down. He should have come back in 2014. Have you heard that as well?
Yes, those things were often said, but that's not entirely true, because at a certain point when the war had already entered its hot phase, Russia did, of course, provide substantial humanitarian aid, a huge amount of humanitarian aid, and then military specialists began to appear. As someone who fought in the Donbas militia, I did see them from time to time, of course. But these were not Russian armies, as it was portrayed in the West.
It wasn't the Russian army that came to the Donbas. But for example, 52 men led by the former FSB officer Igor Girkin, known as Strelkov, came to Sloviansk. How did you experience that? What happened there?
Well, to begin with, it should be said that of the 52 people in Strelkov's unit, around 42 or 43 were Ukrainian citizens. In other words, they were from Donbas or from Crimea. They were local people, and Strelkov was not subordinate to any FSB. This was his personal initiative. And that personal initiative, to put it mildly, caused irritation in Moscow. There is a businessman in Russia named Konstantin Malofeyev. They say, I don't know this myself, but they say that he gave Strelkov some money for this venture.
Дал каких-то денег Стрелкову на это предприятие. Но я хочу сказать, что с тех пор Konstantin Malofeyev...
But I want to say that since then, Konstantin Malofeyev has not been on the best terms with the Kremlin, with the administration, because none of this was coordinated with anyone. Nobody needed it. Moscow was extremely irritated that it happened at all. And broadly speaking, of course, Strelkov's expedition into Donbas. We have to remember that it took place when government buildings in Donetsk, Luhansk, and about 10 cities across Donbas had already been seized by local residents. In other words, it did not all start with him. Events were already unfolding before Strelkov arrived.
They say, once an intelligence officer, always an intelligence officer, and that is used to argue that Strelkov, Igor Girkin, was sent by the officials in Moscow. On the other hand, you mentioned Malofeyev. How do you assess that? Did Malafayev give him the money? They had business ties after all. He was once Malafayev's head of security.
Well, yes, they say he headed the security service. At that time, I wasn't acquainted with either Strelkov or Malafayev, and like you, I got that information from the media. But I'll repeat once again, I was in Donbas, and I knew that by the time Strelkov appeared, Mozgovoy was already there. The local Donbas field commander who led the uprising in Donbas was Zakharchenko, a Donetsk field commander who led the uprising there. That is, I saw many local leaders who, even without Strelkov, had already voiced their dissatisfaction with the coup d'etat in Kyiv. And I assure you, the situation would have developed without Strelkov. Without Strelkov.
You mentioned Strelkov in your war diary. You wrote that he withdrew his troops from Sloviansk in mid-2014, and you said he really should have been awarded a medal for that. Why?
No, I didn't say that. I'm in no position to judge Strelkov's actions, because I wasn't in Sloviansk myself. But the people who led the militia in Donetsk, including Zakharchenko, viewed the withdrawal of troops from Sloviansk negatively. Still, I'll say again, since I was serving in rank-and-file positions at the time, I try not to judge such things. It's not for me to decide. What happened, happened.
What is your criticism of Zelensky?
I can once again refer to the view of my senior colleagues, including Alexander Zakharchenko, who said that if Igor Ivanovich Strelkov had not left Sloviansk, then by now, in 2022, the goals Vladimir Putin talks about would in fact already have been achieved. Because Putin says we must reach the borders of Donbas, that is, the borders of the Donetsk Republic, where Kramatorsk and Sloviansk are located, the very cities Strelkov left. Essentially, 11 years later, we are fighting for the very point on the map where it all began.
The
war is being fought over the city of Sloviansk. If the militia had remained there, there would be no precedent today. It needs to be explained that the referendum held by the residents of Donbas in 2014 took place across the entire Donetsk Republic, including in Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, where an overwhelming majority of citizens spoke in favor of joining Russia. So in essence, what is being restored is the will of the citizens. That is what this is about. There is a formal logic to it, and Strelkov here is simply one episode in this enormous confrontation.
You mentioned Zakharchenko earlier, and when I was in Donbas, I noticed that the people in Donetsk hold Zakharchenko in very high regard. What was your relationship with Zakharchenko like?
He was a genuine historical figure. And it is important to note one thing here. Because in any discussion of the Donbas resistance, the conversation immediately turns to Strelkov. A great deal is said about Strelkov, and that is normal. But the fact is that after Strelkov left for Russian territory in the summer, in August 2014, the confrontation continued for 8 years. And the Donbas army, both the Donetsk and Luhansk forces, held back the Ukrainian army. For some reason, this is not talked about. Strelkov was in Donbas for 3 months, while Zakharchenko fought for 8 years. But Western media, strangely enough, give this minimal attention. Among other things, I would like to point out that even back then, in the summer and fall of 2014, we were already finding large numbers of dead Polish mercenaries, for example. I saw 36 passports belonging to Polish mercenaries. There were American specialists there, British specialists. There was just about everyone there. In other words, it was a major Western special operation from the start. They all came, studied a potential adversary, helped Ukraine carry out military operations and build fortifications. But we say nothing about that. We discuss Strelkov. Meanwhile, all of Kiev's administrative centers, were full of the CIA, British intelligence, whoever you can think of. For some reason, that isn't discussed. Zakharchenko led a popular national resistance against a force many times larger than Donbas. Donbas has 2 million people living there, 2.5 million. Ukraine had 30 million people at the time. Just imagine the difference. And Donbas held the line for 8 years.
Какова была разница, и Донбасс 8 лет держал удар.
You mentioned the CIA's involvement. The New York Times reported that since 2015, the CIA had 12 secret stations in the Donbas. Do you know how far back this cooperation, this CIA involvement in the Donbas went?
Мы не могли с Донбасса это оценить, но
We couldn't assess it from Donbas, but we very often saw American specialists at the positions. We saw them helping build fortifications. We constantly found NATO uniforms there, some NATO weapons. Intelligence constantly intercepted conversations in English. So I can only assess it from the trenches. I didn't follow politics. But there, it was no secret to anyone that the entire other side was full of every kind of NATO representative you could imagine.
Представителями НАТО, какие только можно возможно вообразить.
You mentioned Western mercenaries. According to an account by Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, American mercenaries from the company Academy, formerly Blackwater, had been on the Ukrainian side in Donbas since March 2014. That confirms what you said. Were Wagner mercenaries also in Donbas, or Russian mercenaries?
Вагнеровцы были, да, они выполняли там.
Wagner fighters were there. Yes, they carried out operations there. They would go in and come out. I know there was an operation carried out by Wagner to liberate Luhansk airport. Ukrainian armed forces were based there and constantly shelled Luhansk. Wagner went in, and quite quickly and decisively, in the course of a single battle, drove the Ukrainian troops out of there. But I never encountered them personally, and I would not exaggerate Wagner's role. I mean, I know of one operation. Maybe there was another one. But I assure you that most of the operations carried out by the military who were in Donbas were conducted by the Donetsk militia.
American military analyst Scott Ritter told me that Wagner was founded in Crimea by Dmitry Utkin in March or April of 2014. Do you know anything about that? What is your understanding?
No, maybe that was the case then. But I want to say again that at the time when I was serving in the Donbas Army, in 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018, Wagner's main area of activity was Syria and Africa. The majority of their contingent was stationed there. And I spent a lot of time there, in Donbas. I talked to many people and knew many people, but I never once in my life personally met a single Wagner fighter. Maybe something was going on there. Maybe they showed up there. But they were neither the driving force nor the foundation of the armed confrontation.
During the years you mentioned, starting in 2015, you were also in close contact with Zakharchenko. You worked with him. How would you characterize him?
He was a true natural talent, a figure of great history. He entered major politics not because of some political consulting construct, but simply by right of his courage and charisma. He was a genuine popular leader. People adored him. And in the 21st century, it seems like that is no longer possible. It seems that all leaders are created in test tubes by one kind of political consultant or another, then presented to the people, pretending to be someone they are not. We live in a time when it is already impossible to imagine Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, or other representatives of the people. But it turns out that sometimes it still happens. And I am happy that I was close to this man, that I was his friend, and that I watched his rise.
What was your relationship with Zakharchenko? What role did you play in the Donbas?
I created one of the units in his guard. a battalion that was also made up of roughly 80 to 90% volunteers from Luhansk and Donetsk. And since I came to Zakharchenko from the media world, I served as his advisor on how to build relations with Russian journalists, with Russian politics, and with public opinion. Because here, I probably need to explain once again that there was no direct control of Zakharchenko from Moscow, and there was no permanent presence of Moscow political consultants in Donbas. There was no one beside him. Beside him were me and one other person. His name was Alexander Kazakov. We were his two advisors.
Его звали Александр Казаков, мы были два его советника, и мы оба приехали не от Кремля, мы приехали не от ФСБ.
Neither of us came from the Kremlin. We didn't come from the FSB. We were just ordinary people he met there in 2014 and 2015. He liked us and invited us to work with him. We had no instructions from Putin, Shoigu, Narishkin, or anyone else. It was a completely spontaneous story. It was taking shape right before my eyes. It was an improvisation. He simply saw me as someone from Russia who understood certain things he was curious about. By that point, since 1991, what was it, 1991 to 2001, well, he had already spent all of his youth and adult life in Ukraine. He was a product of Ukraine as a separate state. He needed to understand how everything worked in Russia.
Saakashvili was killed in an assassination. What happened? Who was behind it?
The perpetrators of the terrorist act were detained right away, within a few days. They were two SBU officers, two SBU employees. I don't know if they were officers or not, but two SBU employees. They immediately admitted that they were SBU employees. But the subsequent investigation led to major business interests of Ukrainian oligarchs. And somewhere up there, at that very high level, the trail of the investigation is lost to me. Beyond that, I don't know. But I do know that it was carried out by SBU employees.
Since you mentioned the oligarchs, what role did Akhmetov play in 2014? He seems to me to have been a shady figure.
Well, at that time, Moscow still hoped it could resolve the situation in Donbas with Akhmetov's help. Akhmetov gave Moscow guarantees that he would preserve peace, that he would reach an agreement with Kiev, that he would act as a mediator. But it was the wrong game. Akhmetov was not playing in Donbas's interests. He was playing for himself and for Kiev. That became clear fairly quickly, and Zakharchenko banned Akhmetov from entering Donbas. Akhmetov, his people, and his journalists, because Akhmetov was not pursuing the interests of the majority of Donbas's population. He was pursuing the interests of his own business.
Did Akhmetov switch sides very quickly because he had his money in the West?
Of course, he had money in the West. But here, you see, I have to say something very important. What was happening in Donbas was also a challenge for Moscow, for the Kremlin, in another sense. After all, Moscow and the Kremlin were used to dealing with what you would call serious people, serious opponents, presidents, oligarchs, people with high financial status. But Donbas, that was a territory where they had to deal with so-called field commanders. In other words, yesterday, a person was a music teacher at a school, and today he was in charge of an entire city, with a whole people's army under his command. Zakharchenko was a businessman, not one of the biggest, and he ended up leading an entire region. So Moscow had to change the way it operated on the fly. They had long since gotten out of the habit of this. They're big capitalists. They need big capitalists on the other side of the negotiating table. So from the start, they tried to deal with Akhmetov and several other figures. I wouldn't be surprised if they even spoke with Kolomoisky. They could have talked to anyone. They hoped they could resolve it at the highest level, at the level of top leadership, top financial leadership. But it turned out that this was the people. The people are the main driving force.
Донецк и Луганск.
And that is why Donetsk and Luhansk called their republics the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. This was a precedent, you understand. It was a precedent in the world, a revolution that was not created, not man-made, but arose from below, where neither Strelkov, nor Malofeyev, nor the FSB, no one had any significance whatsoever. And really, it is ridiculous to talk about this, considering that half of Europe's leaders came to Kyiv's Maidan. Presidents, prime ministers, everyone you could imagine was there. And these people somehow managed to tell us, oh, you had former FSB officer Strelkov come there. It is simply ridiculous, you understand. It's a ridiculous conversation.
In 2015, you were in the Donbas. That was when Ukrainian troops came under pressure, and the Minsk agreements were then negotiated. How did that come about? How did you experience it?
I see it in two ways. Because if Russia had truly sent in its army at that time, as they said in the West, then of course we would have reached Kiev swiftly, within 2 weeks. Without question, the Ukrainian armed forces then were incomparable to the Russian armed forces. Russia would have won, 100%. But at that time, our deeply democratic government, and I'm not exaggerating or being ironic, believed they would be able to reach an agreement with the West and the United States in the most fair and bloodless way possible and obtain some form of autonomy, specifically autonomy for Donbas. That is exactly what the negotiations were about. Donbas would receive a separate status within Ukraine, with the Russian language preserved. Russia was offering the most benevolent terms possible toward the Kiev statehood. But no one agreed to those terms, because the collective West and the United States had completely different goals.
You experienced it on the ground, including in the years following the Minsk agreements. Would you say these were sham agreements, intended, so to speak, to enable the West to arm Ukraine?
Well, that's how it turned out in the end. Of course, Ukraine and the West made very intensive use of those 7 or 8 years. They built extremely powerful defensive lines with no equal. They created an extremely powerful army, an extremely powerful special forces capability. They rearmed the entire Ukrainian military, replacing the remnants of Soviet weaponry with the latest NATO weapons systems. In 8 years, they created one of the most powerful armies in the world. They did an excellent job.
Former U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said in an interview with the New York Times that the United States secretly provided Ukraine with massive military support in September and December of 2021. Do you have any information about that? What did you observe there on the ground?
No, by then I was no longer serving in the Donbas army. After Zakharchenko's death, I left Donbas. But I don't think we should focus on specific dates. They were held in 2020, 2021, 2018, 2017, and 2015. They were conducted continuously throughout that entire period.
Did the Russian Federation invade on February 24, 2022, because Moscow felt it was under pressure to act? How do you assess that?
I am not familiar with the intelligence data. I don't know whether they were moving them or not. But I am absolutely convinced that Ukraine's army was being prepared to retake Donbas and attack Crimea. And of course, Russia could no longer afford not to retake Crimea or to allow a genocide to take place in Donbas. And it was certain to us that in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, there would have been a bloody purge of everyone involved in the Russian Spring. Since 90% of the population was involved, we can imagine the scale of the bloodshed that would have taken place there. That is why it happened on February 24th. It could have happened in March, a month earlier, or 6 months later. But it would have happened inevitably, and it was not our fault.
Then you went back into the war zone. What duties did you take on there?
I signed a contract with the Russian National Guard and carried out the combat missions assigned to me by the leadership. I simply became part of a large system. When I was a Donbas militiaman, I worked out and came up with all the tasks right at Zakharchenko's table. Now, we simply carried out the tasks set by the top leadership. These were ordinary combat missions, nothing extraordinary.
Can you talk about what you did there, where you were deployed?
At that time, we were stationed in the Luhansk region, doing counter-sabotage work. Then, after Rosgvardia, I signed a contract with the Volunteer Corps and once again served in the Luhansk region. So I spent the first 3 years of the war in the Donetsk region and the next 3 years of the war in the Luhansk region. Some details about this can be found in my books, Militia Romance, and Some Will Not Go to Hell. Unfortunately, they haven't been translated into German, but they have been translated into Polish and French. You can read about it there. I won't speak about it out loud because I am under every conceivable sanction, and anything I say in an interview could be used against me if I am detained.
2023 was a turning point in your life. An attempt was made on your life and you were seriously injured. What exactly happened? How did it unfold?
A terrorist, recruited by the Ukrainian intelligence services, along with a group of his accomplices, followed me for a year and a half, studying my routes. And eventually, while I was on vacation, returning from a business trip to my village, they planted 2 anti-tank mines on the road I was traveling. One of them exploded. The other failed to detonate. Sitting next to me was my friend and fellow serviceman, Alexander Shubin. He was killed instantly. I suffered a spinal fracture, 9 fractures in my legs, and around 30 other injuries. But I survived by a miracle because anti-tank mines blow up tanks and I was driving a passenger car. But it was a German car. And besides Thomas Mann, that is another reason for me to respect Germany.
Well, I experienced the explosion of an anti-tank mine myself once. It really is a miracle that you survived it. How are you doing now? Have your legs healed?
Yes, I passed the medical evaluation and returned to the armed forces. Besides the German vehicle, there were also excellent Soviet surgeons who performed a miracle on the very first night after I was brought to the hospital.
Since 2022, I believe you have been under EU sanctions. Does that affect you in any way?
The homeland comes above all else, and the suffering of my people, including the people of Donbas, matters far more than sanctions. Sanctions? Dozens of my closest comrades have been killed, hundreds of my fellow soldiers. Overall, a huge number of people have died. So what? Sanctions? That is the least one can pay for this.
You experienced the war firsthand. How will this war end? What do you expect? Will it end at the negotiating table or be decided on the battlefield?
Well, for now, it won't end in anything, because it's at a dead end. Offensive operations are virtually impossible. The sky, especially at low altitude, is saturated with drones. But I understand perfectly well that as long as the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev has not been eliminated, there can be no talk of any long-term peace.
Earlier, at the start of our conversation, you drew a distinction between the people of Germany and the German government. What do you say to the people in Germany who do not want this war?
I would like any pro-Russian forces, genuine left-wing forces, and forces sympathetic to the history of the Soviet Union and the history of the GDR. We had a great many comrades there at the time, to unite and grow stronger. I want more people to vote for them, and for them to have greater influence over politics. I call on our German comrades, partners, and potential friends to work within the legal framework, because a radical rightward turn will not lead any country anywhere good, whether it is Ukraine, Germany, Argentina, or Russia. It all ends horribly, with xenophobia and massive bloodshed.
Чудовищно заканчивается ксенофобией и огромным кровопролитием.
Zakhar Prilepin, der russische
Zakhar Prilepin, the Russian best-selling author, says that in 2014 there was a popular uprising in the Donbas in response to the coup on the Maidan. He says this popular uprising was not organized by Moscow. Overall, he says the war, including the Russian invasion, is a struggle for survival by the people of Russia and the Russian Federation. And he calls on people in Germany to strengthen the forces for peace.
Thank you very much for your time.
Спасибо.
And we at Gegen den Strom will not be intimidated by censorship nor by sanctions. We show you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep silent about.